We're here in the beautiful Botanic Gardens as part of the Dublin Book Festival, and we're going to be talking to Oein DeBhairduin on the launch of his new book, Why the Moon Travels, illustrated by Leanne McDonagh.
The wonderful artist.
I have to say, I read some of the stories, absolutely beautiful book, beautiful stories.
I appreciate it.
So why the interest in travel stories?
Well, first off, I think it's an amazing opportunity to have this conversation with yourself, from one traveller to another. Okay. But as you know yourself, that the travellers have been able to maintain a connection to an ancient lineage of storytelling and our I suppose, remembrance that many people in the wider generation don't have. I was quite lucky to be, I suppose, to be born and reared and nurtured in a family where stories were a very innate part of our growing up, and the ways they shows, I suppose, to bring order to a lot of chaos, but also to bring teachings and also to have a bit of fun, and show that the world is quite more mysterious and beautiful and thrilling than sometimes we realise.
Yeah, because reading some of the stories, one of the things I noticed that came across from the stories is the way you actually write about it and the way you frame some of the words in it, and it's very poetic. And I would have remembered I think storytelling I would have heard was, say, maybe the late 60s up to the mid 80s, and then it stopped.
Yeah.
So how would you have heard those stories?
I was looking up, I was looking to have some of my grandparents growing up, and then my father said would have a huge interest in local folklore. Right, and also I went looking for them. I was kind of the young person that would actually ask for those stories. Right. Not just the idea of because a lot of our stories that survive are about, specifically about people. It might be our ancestors or our neighbours, and a lot based on kind of people. But also I'm interested in going, what are our stories around the land, and around our connection with the land? Yeah. And even most people in the Irish tradition would know why the robin has a red chest and why the wren is the king of all birds. But then you have the question going, what about the other stuff? Like, why is this tree here, and why are the rivers there? And it's about pulling at those stuff. And I was a very curious child. Yeah. And which kind of comes in conflict because I was also an incredibly shy child. So I had this huge kind of inner world of workings and kind of questions. And I was lucky to be in the position that people around me not only wanted to listen to me, but also wanted to talk to me.
Right.
Right. And so kind of, and I think what it is that it's really important to state that they are retellings. I think we should never create something that's the story, because these stories settles the story and fixes it. And while a story allows people's own perceptions and abilities and insights and worldview to come through it, and that's what I think is really important, and has really been certainly maintained within the travel tradition. Now there's little gaps here and there, but you'd be surprised once you start asking people, because I know when I was creating and writing and reviewing the book and editing in a way, the amount of other stories that people had forgotten about just started to surface. Yes. And a lot of it is because no one had asked them why. No one had actually asked them for those stories. So I think the book comes with an opportunity, to share something that I hope could stand as a good book and a decent book and a beautiful book, but also a challenge to us all to remember. Yeah,
because even though you're saying it yourself, but one of the things about storytelling is you tell the story and then you give it to someone else to add their bit to that story, which is exactly what you're saying. Yeah. And I think, because my father was a traditional storyteller, and I know you're a father. Yeah. I met your father a couple of times, and he's a storyteller. And I love, and I suppose you probably love it yourself, where the story is being told by someone else. Yeah. And you're going, oh, that's another little word or an angle that comes into it. And
what I noticed, though, is that within some of the wider community, doesn't usually happen. It's very kind of, I read people are very hesitant going, this is the story, this is the formula, this is what happened. Yes. And they're going, that's what happened in their story. Yeah. What happens in your story? And those stories, not about what's right, what's wrong. It's like going, both are valid, but which ones are you giving beauty to? And they're all beautiful, but it's like kind of seeing the rainbow. You don't sit going, well, I like the blue and the orange, or you just say, that's a beautiful rainbow, Yes. And it's about actually taking it in the context and just embracing it.
Yes, because when I was reading the story, which I'm going to read later on, the yew tree, there was two ways of telling the story. One was about your childhood in the graveyard, and then you had the mythical side of the tree and why the tree was there, and then the story behind why the tree was there. Yeah. And when I was reading it, it put me in mind of stories I would have heard, say, from the Native American Indian or First Nation people, as they call themselves now, or the Aborigines. And I thought that style came really true in that story, and one or two more other stories.
Yeah, because I think, especially within travel traditions, you said anamorphism of the idea that nature is alive. Yes, the land. So they kind of go we have things that go well, that's the Gammy Road, the Tober. It's almost like the life around us is very much alive and a part of us. Right. It's not just a distinct idea. Yes. And then when you start peeling away that goes much, much deeper. And it goes to a universal level, and where we're not just people existing in a space, we're a part of nature, living with it.
Yeah.
And when a lot of our people behind us would have lived so intimately with nature, it was a factor that really was a part of their lives.
Yes.
And there was three things that really came across when I was like doing the stories that come strongly within our tradition. One is that you always tell where a story comes from. You know, and always change it from the context where you are. The story is going to be very different if you're on the side of a river, if you're on top of a mountain. But you weave it into it. And then we always have the responsibility to pass it on. Even if we do the most horrendous job of it. If someone has given you something, you could be the last person to tell it. So as long as you pass it on, it gives it new life.
Yeah, because I think there's an interesting way from the colourful images in your story is, animation. Making cartoons for children is a beautiful way of telling a good story, because even though, and I know, the way of telling stories is not as strong as it used to be.
No.
And the kids have so much out there now in this
Extra
media,
stimuli and TV.
like games and television and 101 channels, as they call it. And then you have the social media. They're missing out on that. So even the coloured images and the images of the story that come across from what I was reading is absolutely quite beautiful.
Oh, thanks very much.
So one of the things it would be an idea is to emanate some of the stories.
Something I'd be very open to.
Or even emanate a story in a book, because even it's a beautiful book.
Yeah. But just a different way for people to engage with it.
Yes, because I think it's important, as you probably would agree with this, to make sure that the stories that we have in the book and the other stories that are out there.
But that's something we're exploring as well, and we've also done an audiobook of it to make sure that the oral tradition, because when I was doing the stories, like how it started, that I actually recorded it orally first on a dictaphone, and I listened back to it and I made sure that it did a rest in me, or did it actually sound how a story should sound to me, and then I transcribed that into script.
That's my style as well.
Yeah, it makes, and it's like, because it's part of the storytelling tradition, the idea of going, rather than the visual kind of external, the idea would be, does that actually affect you? Does that resonate in you? So what I did to make sure that it was kind of the part of it would be the audio recording, so it would hopefully make it more accessible to people, especially of different generations.
Particularly also with the high literacy, the high problem, like
the barriers in place.
Yeah, the barriers and the high literacy among travellers, especially the older travellers.
Yeah.
And listening to the book would be quite beautiful.
Yeah, and also some people just resonate better with something that's auditory.
Yes, right.
And the same way as well, that the images, like with Leanne McDonagh, what it is that we give her the stories, and there was very little editing on them. It was more or less she just showed them to us. But what I was really focusing on is going, just draw your version of the story. Right. You know, the way the same way is like going, like you were saying earlier, about how you get the story and you reinterpret it and you give it new life. And that was a part of that, which means it wasn't the kind of like going, that giant had ears that were pointed. It was like kind of going, what do you get from that story? You know, what resonates in you? And then you become it, because her drawings is just another form, and as valid as a written form, of storytelling. So it was just a way to make sure that it had a new life to it.
Yeah.
And hopefully it'll keep growing.
Yeah, because the reason why I picked the yew tree was because of the relationship that we have with the graveyards and with the dead and with the spirits. Yeah. And then the story about the tree is one of the reasons why I picked it. But also around the loss of people. Yeah. And I think the reason why the story resonated with me so much was because of the climate that we live in now at the moment. That story meant an awful lot. And even your summary at the end, which I will talk about later on, that is very effective, I think so, that we can become lost. Yeah, we can become lost. We can lost in the loss. Yeah. The thing as well is that, like, growing up genuinely, and you're sure yourself that, like, graveyards aren't always morose, morbid places. They're a place we can reconnect and remember and stand at the edges of kind of, we're describing the tangled web of kind of, I suppose, the brambles of ancestry, because we know our family trees aren't really trees. They're wild wildernesses. And it's a place about remembering and loss, but also of solace, to know that the people are still close to you. You know, and in Tuam itself, what I mentioned, that there's actually a plaque in Tuam on a wall that just says for all the named and unnamed travellers in the graveyards across the world. And I kind of forget that like throughout our world and our lands, vast majority of people, like pre-60s, were never marked. We never, and we remember where they are and where they live, but never marked. And so that can bring a distance. But I do think there is a lesson in the idea of when we stand too long in sorrow, we lose ourselves. But also from reading the other stories, like every time you go fishing at a river or you were staying in the old tenter wagons, the biggest problem the evening time is the midges. The midges you say is alive, and you'd have to push the horse down in case you get the horse fly by. So all those images are beautiful in it. And I think what I really liked, which came across, particularly the connection of the storytelling and travellers, was the gammon. The traveller language. And you do use I mean, you use it in a way that it's not too much for people. They'll actually understand what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's very natural. Like
very natural is the word. Yeah.
And I didn't want to. And part of the process that there was stuff that we say, like obviously, like you were very used to. We say like crush on and and stall and
the
like
scene and
wait. And I didn't want to edit that because part of the story is like I want to tell my story.
Yeah.
And if I went into all that stuff, I'm trying to create a product for settled people. When in fact I just want to tell a good story.
Yes.
Yeah. And so and part of our language is very important to me. I think
the connection.
It's beautiful.
The connection is there.
And the history of it.
Yes.
And the sense that there's this pretense of like going, it's a secret language.
Yeah.
And you're going, I have 11 dictionaries, trust me, it's not secret.
Yeah.
But also it's just that we use it in a very different way, and we can be very protective of it. At the same time, when we do use it, we use it in a really kind of celebratory going, I'm really proud of this. Like in the middle of everything, we would hold this. Because just like Irish, the amount of Irish people who can't speak Irish, and I never find that kind of an embarrassing thing for people because people have lost the language or it's been taken from them.
Yeah.
And the fact we've been able to maintain a language in such a way under such oppression and such a distraction and create something beautiful out of it, I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah, but there's also a very gentle way of saying the mink here fiend.
Yeah.
Or the lacking.
Yeah.
But then when you're saying gloak or sham,
you
know it's about settled people.
Yeah.
And that comes across as well.
Yeah,
like you're talking about them and then you're talking about us, which comes across in the writing of it, which is great.
Yeah, and the stuff in the stories that travellers will get that I didn't explain.
No.
And other people don't get, and that was fine. It's like, you don't have to explain that, and that's valid.
And I think that is so important because even when I'm doing my shows, the travellers will laugh at something before the settled people laugh at it because the travellers know what's coming. I think they'll know what's coming in the book. Yeah. So just one question, poetry. Yeah. Do you see yourself going down that road because you're almost there? Yeah, well, there's a bit of a Hennessy in it. Yeah, no,
that's a high praise. I do genuinely think, I think everyone's a poet. I just think some people don't have either a platform or a space to write something. Yeah. You know, and what the book was, the kind of going, I realised that there's a part of a lyric kind of focus in me, but it's very much down to the word. You know, and which is really interesting because a lot of my mother's family are deaf or hard of hearing. Right. You know, and they maintain a storytelling tradition as well, just through a different way. You know, and how they focus on stuff, and they've learned to kind of audioise or to describe or to give visuality to something. And but I think poetry is something that we all do. We just do, like some people can create the most, like here we are today, the Botanic Gardens. This itself is a physical poetry. Yes, like people have created something, you know, and they've caught the wild and they've tried to channel it in a certain way, but as you can tell, nature will always overcome anyways. But that itself is an act of poetry, and I'm just lucky and blessed enough to have the
poetry I was just talking about. The poet is there.
But
so
it's
we have to get this book of poems, a book of traveller poems coming out next.
Who knows?
Bit of poetry, no harm at all.
Yeah.
Well, I wish you all the best with the book.
I
hope people enjoy it and enjoy the read and the audio.
Yeah.
I hope people will enjoy that. And I think that an awful lot of travellers will enjoy it, along with settled people.
Yeah, and thank you very much. And I'm actually absolutely privileged because this is the first time this is going to be performed. Yeah. So I'm absolutely privileged to be performed by someone like yourself.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing is, I think that people will be doing more performances in the future. Yeah. Because I would listen to anybody just sitting down and reading what I've seen in the book. So looking forward to that as well.
That's high praise.
And maybe someday we might get together. I'll do the show. You do the readings.
Yeah, there we go. It's a plan.
Good luck with it.
Thanks very much, Michael. Thank you.
I spent a lot of my time as a child in graveyards, but not in a Morse way. But in a way that many people from the travelling community spend time in graveyards. Travellers don't often have a permanent place in life, so when we die, we would mark the ground with a stone to say we were there. We would visit friends, of course, and the quarterly mass. We also visit the grave of loved ones on their birthday, on grief days and on high holidays, and when the extended family come to town. Every relation, every loved one, every kindred friend is remembered. We go to the graveyard among those who stand in the edge of our shared experience. And when dreams remind us of them and sweetly sung songs invoke their memory, keeping them alive in stories and where they were and how they existed on the weary brambles of ancestry. All those, free and able, settle or travel, whose heart were light enough to carry them to the streets of Tuam, always went for the quarter mass on the 6th of June, St. Charles' feast day. We didn't willingly go to a sorrowful place with a heavy heart, in case the carnival would mire us to that place. There is the old graveyard and the new graveyard, and in the centre there's a large space filled with unmarked famine graves. We would gather in the middle, packed tightly in the graveyard, even though the graveyard was huge, as if tied together with invisible string. In the west of the graveyard, there was an old sandstone memorial cemented to the wall, which was marked with no traveller names, but it was for travellers, remembered and forgotten, buried in unmarked graves and unnamed places in Tuam, graveyard and across the world. Unbaptized and nameless travelling children would be usually buried in unconsecrated ground. In the cradle of ancient sites, latrines, near holy wells, blessed wells and sacred places. But on rare occasions, travelling children could be buried in consecrated soil of a graveyard, which otherwise would have been barred to them for not having name nor the grace of baptismal waters. Those who recently lost a friend, a relative or a neighbour could lay their still children at the feet of the deceased. Their little baskets would be tenderly carried to their rest in known and trusted arms. In many of the graveyards of Ireland, at the feet of those who have journeyed before us, sleep swallowed children, safe in the care of the kind-hearted custodian. In this graveyard, not far from my family home, stands a scattering of tall yew trees, beaten by age, weather and the wave of grief that they have endured from all those who passed by them. I recall admiring them as a child, those beautiful, solemn figures rooted throughout the sacred place, the high, cold, grey stone walls, and the dark iron gates that mark the boundary lines between the place of the dead and that of the living. One year, although we went in June, it felt like an autumn morning, still crisp, clear and cold. But the warmth of the people brought a reminder of the rising days of summer. I remember asking my father later on that day about the yew trees and why they're almost always found in graveyards. Many years ago, on a date not recalled exactly, distant enough to be forgot about, but recent enough to be still spoken about, there was a young mink-haired fiend, newly married, with a beautiful child and a home filled with such love and care that the dawn brought only joy, twilight and no quarrels. He worked in the market, she spun lace, and the jolly-hearted lacking left laughter in her footsteps and smiles in her wake. His hands were rough and gentle, accustomed to hard work. Hers were light and nimble, fingertips callous from the tatting of the fine silken lace. They lived for some years knowing only the glow of shared kindness and hope of a bright future. But one year, however, in the depths of the winter, their home was visited by a quick fever, and all three were struck by it. Their limbs were heavy, smouldering like the charred branches of a campfire. Their laboured breaths like it strangled smoke. By the second day, the wife and child had succumbed to it, and on the third day, the young man recovered and woke to their loss. His legs were heavy, soft like a willow, pale face awashed with the sweat of cold winter dew. Bleached of charm and warmth, he was bereft and gripped by the loss of his loved ones. His body felt heavy, like dark mice peat, trodden on by innumerous feet. Gushes of anger deep-mitted into his bones and struck him when he moved. His one strong being, as fragile and jagged as broken eggshells. After the funeral, he stayed by the grave until the light had passed and a fresh dawn was breaking on the horizon. His friends came and brought him home, welcoming him back to the world of the living with company and life conversation, poaching to soothe his heart and good food to rekindle the embers of his wounded spirit. The next day the man returned to the graveyard until his friends came and again brought him home. Each day the pattern repeated. The man would rise from his bed and wander to the graveside. The days would pass, and in the stillness of the night, his friends would seek him out and bring him home again. Soon he refused to go home, shunning his friends and staying in the graveyard to watch over the grave of his loved ones. He stood a solitary and bewildered figure, his once bright future in ashes. The man had neither north nor south, nor the track of road back to who he had once been. Over time, his skin became cracked and darkened by the sun, the rain, and the gales. His hair became tangled with twigs and feathers and spiders. And as the days passed, he grew colder and fixed, rigid and unmoving. Even his voice, once warm as speech, had changed to a mumble of life's creaks and crackles. His clothes weathered and grew green with mildew and moss, and his tears, still sharp with loss, were red round droplets against his cracked skin. His toes, knowing the earth beneath his feet so very well, grew long and twisted, reaching down to the familiar spot and rooting him into place. His toenails, coiled and gnarled, crawled through the soil and the stone, snapping the tendril tendrils in the dark earth beneath the quiet soil of the graveyard. What once was a daily visit, a heartfelt pilgrimage of remembrance and connection, has become the loss of a coming home, and he became something else. What stood at the graveyard was no longer the shade nor shape of a kind man, a good husband and a doting father, but instead the figure of cracked bark-like skin, green spine from age, and red berries from the tears that still spilled from him. And in the lock of his grief, the man had become the first ever yew tree.